Welcome to AWID. AWID is a global feminist membership and movement support organization. My name is Hakima Abbas. I'm the co-executive director of AWID. As an AWID member, you're joining a constellation of women's rights and feminist organizations, communities, networks, and activists who dedicate themselves to building a better world. At AWID, we believe in the power of feminist movements to take action, transform lives, and create just societies.
Women of all ages, occupations, and economic standing vowing to fight gender inequality, stereotypes, and much more.
We're delighted to have you join us and thousands of other feminists from around the world to build our collective power by sharing, learning, and taking action together. We invite you to fight back against fascisms, fundamentalisms, and authoritarianism, and to demand just economies. As an AWID member, you have the power to connect with feminists all around the world. You'll have access to rich resources, publications, and opportunities to learn and share. Welcome to AWID.
Welcome everybody. For those who don't know me, my name's Isabel Marler and I will be your host for today's conversation. I'm a feminist from the United Kingdom and I'm also a member of the Advancing Universal Rights and Justice team at AWID. That's the team that works to understand and resist fascisms and fundamentalisms from a feminist perspective. So for those of you who may not know, AWID is a global feminist organisation and we exist to support feminist movements. As you've seen from our intro video, we are a membership organisation and we invite you to join as a member if you're not already. So today we're going to be discussing Rights at Risk, Time for Action, which is the latest trends report from the Observatory on the Universality of Rights, known as OURS. OURS is a collaborative initiative between a number of organisations which came around a few years ago, spurred on by a shared concern about the number of ultra-conservative, anti-rights and fundamentalist groups gaining influence globally, and particularly to address the effect on our human rights systems. From that time onwards, the initiative has grown, it has evolved. We now have around 20 organisations in the working group, and we have produced agenda-setting knowledge on the state of anti-rights organising internationally. So the first report, Rights at Risk, which came out in 2017, gave a kind of lay of the land of the key anti-rights actors active in international spaces, the discourses they're using, their strategies, and the impact they were having at the time. The second report builds on this. It talks about some prominent actors in the current landscape. We look more at their funding, and we go on to give further tools to debunk some of the main rhetoric that they use. We also bring in more context analysis, so we look at corporate power, nationalisms and repression and closing space for dissent, and we also bring in really positive examples of feminist wins and feminist resistance strategies that we're seeing all over the world, as well as new regional analysis to supplement the international picture. So if you're tuned in today, it's likely that you agree that this is an important topic in the world today. As you'll read in the report, the over half of the world's population right now is governed by far-right leaders, and wherever in the world you're sitting watching this, you probably have your own experiences of far-right propaganda or misinformation. You may be witnessing the different ways in the place where you live that extreme agendas are making their way into the more mainstream conversation and debate, and so that's the backdrop that we're against today. AWID's work in this area, including the work we do with the Hours Initiative, involves research, but this is all very much linked to the work that we do to support movements on the ground, to give more tools and information to better resist fascisms and fundamentalisms. And it's also linked to the work that we do at the international level within spaces like the UN to push for change and to advocate for better standards and to stop the infiltration of anti-rights actors there. In fact, this time, along with the report, we've released a call to action as the Hours Initiative, asking for concrete change. And you'll see during this live conversation, a link to both the report and the call to action will be there for you. And we invite you to download the report, share it with your colleagues, with your networks, and also go to the call to action and add your name to the growing list of people who are calling for an end to anti-rights infiltration within the UN. So the conversation today is going to be a discussion between folks who've been active in this work and in the production of the report, interspersed with a couple of video clips from allies who are also working on this issue. So we're going to bounce off our ideas with their thoughts as well. So we can bring in our guests now. Hi, Mirta. Hi, Naureen. Thank you for being here. So
Hi, Isabel.
Hi. So before we dive in, let's hear a bit about our wonderful guests. Naureen Shameen is a transnational movement organizer and feminist activist with a focus on investigating and challenging anti-rights movements. Naureen is developing a new global feminist project, which I think we're all very excited about. The project is called Noor. And Naureen is also a board member of the transnational solidarity network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws. She's also an independent consultant and researcher, and she was previously working with AWID, and at that time was leading the Advancing Universal Rights and Justice initiative. And as part of that role, she was the lead author of the first Rights at Risk report in 2017, as well as the current Rights at Risk Time for Action report, which we've just released. She's also been a Women and Justice Fellow at Cornell Law School. She's worked with Antirights, the ILO, the Red Cross, and Human Dignity Trust, and she has an academic background in women's rights, religion, and international law from Harvard Law School. Hi, Naureen. And Mirta Moragues-Mireles is a Paraguayan lawyer, a feminist activist, and a human rights advocate. Mirta is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Synergia, Initiatives for Human Rights, which is also a member of the Hours as well. She's also a part of research and a founding member of Vecinas Feministas por la Justicia Sexual y Reproductiva in America Latina. And at the domestic level, she's part of the feminist group Las Ramonas. And her experience lies in research, litigation, and advocacy in issues relating to gender, sexuality, and human rights. And in the context of this conversation, Mirta is also a contributing author, along with Gillian Kane, to the second Hours Trends report, looking at anti-rights trends within the regional human rights bodies of the Americas. So for those of you watching, you can tell this is very much a conversation of people who have been invested with their hearts and minds in these issues for many years, I think it's fair to say, and I'm extremely excited to get into the conversation with you. But just before we do, there's a quick reminder to our audience. This is a live discussion, and we encourage you to express your thoughts and ask questions on whichever platform you're watching, whether you're watching live or to the people in the future watching the recording. Please add your comments in the comments section, and we'll try to address those questions as we go through. So just to start off now, Naureen, Mirta, all of us have been doing this work for a while now to monitor, understand, and resist fascist and fundamentalist influences. But I'd love to hear just a bit more personal reflection from both of you. How did you come to be involved in this work? What was the journey that brought you to where you are today doing this work? And maybe Mirta, you want to tell us a bit first?
Hi, thanks, Isabel. I'm really pleased to be with you and with Naureen here. And also I'm so happy that we have the report out. And so because it was a hard work from all of us. And so I'm really happy. I would say that I am a feminist and a sexual and reproductive rights activist working at the OEAS, the Organization of the American States, since 2009. And in that space, in 2013, we suffered the eruption of the anti-rights at the OAS, like in big masses of anti-rights organizations, trying to undermine what we gain at that space, and also to actually block the adoption of 2 Inter-American conventions that finally was the both were adopted. One is the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, which was worked hard by LGBT organizations and Afro-descendants organization of the OAS. So when that happened, I actually realized that we really need to know more about these groups, their strategies, and that's where I understood that I need to know more about them. So things took me to research about them, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And that kind of story comes out in the chapter as well, about how the things changed over the years in that space. So really interesting read. How about you, Naureen? Do you want to tell us a bit about this?
Sure, absolutely. And I just wanted to say too, thanks so much to Isabel. It's lovely to be here with you and Mirta, and super excited about the report coming out. Mirta, exactly, right? So I would say in terms of what brought me to it, I mean, I guess to go back, 10 or more years, what I found really drew me to this work, challenging fundamentalisms and xenophobic fascisms, is that it felt personal and immediate. And so there's kind of the personal aspect, and then the kind of ideological, theoretical piece, right? So for instance, one of the first ways that I first became involved in this kind of work was with the Transnational Feminist Solidarity Network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, that you mentioned, Isabel. And I was drawn, for instance, by its campaign, which was titled "Violence is Not Our Culture." And so I guess what I was thinking about and what the entry points was important is the ways in which anti-rights actors, I was seeing, they fixate on the bodies and lives of women, right? To make them symbols, and in this way to constrain us within like a web of socio-cultural norms and pressure, the way in which they claim authority over what culture and religion are in order to wield power. And I could see this in many different ways. And also I think what was really powerful and interesting to me in terms of this work is how it can make the invisible visible, right? So it's looking at how ideologies are powerful in large part because they create these mythical and repressive meta-narratives, and they try to cast us as characters or players in this, right? And it's about kind of unpacking, debunking, and demystifying this. And I'd say lastly, in terms of kind of the work at EWID and the hours, I think this work kind of highlights that there's a conscious and strategic manipulation of culture, religion, ideas of nation to achieve power. And so at the Challenging Fundamentalisms program, which is now the Hours program at EWID, and with the Hours, which is an important initiative bringing together feminist organizations and networks and activists, right? I think an important aspect was the approach of focusing on the common trends and tactics of anti-rights across contexts. So there's important local specificities and regional specificities, but I think the value here and the gap that I was seeing in responding to it is in taking a transnational approach to fundamentalisms and fascisms, is to see how many of the actors work transnationally and how the same strategies crop up in place after place. And then that predictive power can help support the work of feminist movements in different spaces. And so I think aiming to address that gap in terms of responses to fundamentalisms and fascisms, I think the Hours and the big crux there was seeing the moment of realizing that anti-rights actors are increasingly active transnationally in global spaces, specifically with rising coordination, resources, and impact and support, where they're undermining and co-opting the human rights framework. And then also, I think a big part of addressing this is that fundamentalisms and fascisms exist across regions, religions, and nations. And so I'll say, the last thing I think was the deep value of coming together in solidarity and boosting our collective power to challenge these, the way they operate across contexts. And then also the importance in terms of focusing on the global and regional spheres of action, right? So feminist alliance building across regions and issue areas there to do the work of reclaiming human rights, reclaim our language, and keep the accountability mechanisms that exist to keep anti-rights actors, fundamentalists, fascists, to keep them accountable and to come together in doing so. So just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, when you mentioned the Violence is Not a Culture campaign, I also thought back to my kind of, because I also worked with women living under Muslim laws back many moons ago, but I think that idea of something that seems so simple now, but the idea that the realization that culture is what is defined as culture has been chosen by whoever is in power, and usually patriarchs, was such a groundbreaking notion that kind of changed everything and set me on this path as well. So it was great to hear from both of you. So now we're gonna have some food for thought from Dr. Nadine Guzman, who's from In Mujeres in Mexico. This is just a clip from a conversation we had back at the Commission on the Status of Women in March, and so we'll hear from her and then move on to our next part of the discussion.
What they're looking for is to return to traditional structures where there was never any room to verbalize injustices that we recognize today and that have been made visible by feminist movement. And we must remain alert and flexible so that we can first understand and identify them as we are with this report, and then adequately respond with knowledge and facts.
So we heard there a reflection in the first part, I guess, a bit about what we're up against. She was framing anti-rights actors as people or agendas that want to kind of keep hold of a world where there's only a small portion of powerful people that get to, you know, denigrate anyone else who doesn't fit that norm. And the new report goes in detail into examining some of these key anti-rights actors, their discourses, their strategies, and to try and kind of connect the dots there. But for those who maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet, since it only came out last week, can you share maybe a bit about who it is that we're actually talking about here when we say anti-rights actors? What's their current approach? Who are they? Ultimately, what is it that they want? And maybe, given that things have changed since 2017 when we first brought out the first edition of the report, maybe you can reflect a bit on where we are today with that. So Naureen, would you like to share first?
Sure, thanks as well. So if we're going to talk about anti-rights actors, who they are, what they want, maybe a couple of thoughts. Like, one, I think when we're talking about anti-rights movements in the context of this work and the context of this report, we're talking about actors who engage in the authoritarian manipulation of religion, culture, and tradition to achieve power, money, and extend social control. So it's strategic, right? I think it's really important to keep in mind that while there are differences in prioritization and framing of agendas, also, and this is part of kind of what's developed in the past few years, there's extensive crossover in worldview, personnel, and resources between anti-rights movements and the far right, and that kind of merging and conflation, right? There's strategic collaboration and alliances between these forces at multiple levels. I'd say also, so the nexus between anti-rights actors and the far right is really key, with both that are really deeply and fundamentally patriarchal and heteronormative, right? That's really at the core. Features in common, I'd say, include, there's construction of a mythic past, right? There's use of propaganda and disinformation. There's fixation on gender and sexuality and on traditional gender roles and expression. There's racist and xenophobic. And while they may frame themselves, this is another aspect, which I think is relevant, as pro-economic justice or anti-globalist, they're actually parasitic on the impacts of neoliberalism and push neoliberal policies, right? And then just in terms of the report too, some specificities, this is looking at both reports together. The type of anti-rights actors that I think we're seeing, especially in global spaces, are of a few types, but very coordinated. Firstly, ultra-conservative civil society organizations that often have neo-imperialist missions based in the United States, for instance, and trying to export. Secondly, religious bodies like the Vatican, which has a status at the UN, and intergovernmental actors like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And then I'd say also state actors, for instance. The first report talked about the Russian Orthodox Church and its role, right? A couple very briefly I'll mention, who are mentioned in this report are of the civil society variety, and both really active nationally, regionally, and at the UN and in global spaces. So one is Citizen Go, for instance. It was founded in Spain in 2013. It's extremely closely linked with overlapping sort of staff with Hastior, and that's an ECOSOC status, which means that it's an NGO that has significant access within the UN, also since 2013, right? Its focuses particularly on abortion, opposing surrogacy, a manipulated concept of religious freedom, traditional family, comprehensive sexual education, opposing the rights of LGBTIQ people. And maybe I'll just mention a couple of their tactics, because you asked about approach, which is founders said they consciously molded themselves after MoveOn.org, which is an online petition platform. And that was kind of its crux. So its key tactics are online petitions and harassment, as well as online to offline campaigns, trainings, and I'd say, in addition to that, they definitely also really focus in terms of spectacle and shock tactics. A lot of people who are at the UN, for instance, and otherwise, they had this really transphobic bright orange bus, which is looking to provoke immediate engagement. I mean, they're very open about this, right? To use that for attention, which had really discriminatory visualization. They had a Hitler bus, which was supposed to oppose gender ideology, right? And so on. And they've also been shown to have connections with the far right party box in Spain, right? So again, that's that connection between the far right and anti-rights actors. And then a second one I'll mention quickly, another actor we specifically talked about in the report is a really big, in terms of budget, over 70 million actor called Alliance Defending Freedom, or ADF. They're US-based, and they focus on strategic litigation as a strategy. They've been designated by SPLC as a hate group, actually, but they're extremely mainstreamed, which is a trend we keep saying, right? And their focus very much in the past decade has also been about expanding internationally, as well as sort of like funding other groups and work, anti-rights groups internationally. They've also been at the UN since 2010. They're evangelical in origins, and they're the group that, for instance, some people might have heard of, anti-LGBTQ cases in the United States, like Masterpiece Cake Shop, etc. They focus on a lot of similar themes as Citizen Go, and they also work on model legislation, like the anti-trans bathroom bills that have been spread in a number of different jurisdictions. And at the UN, I'd say they engage in a double strategy, right? To work actively in the spaces themselves, encouraging other anti-rights groups to work at the UN, not to abandon the institutions of power. And at the same time, that kind of try to cut its legs out from underneath it, right? So it's, at the same time, it tries to undermine and limit and defund a lot of UN mechanisms, like OHCHR, the human rights body, like treaty monitoring bodies, like the UNFPA. And I would say also, in terms of approach, in terms of discourses and tactics, the reports, the most recent report talks a lot about that. I think I'll just say a couple of things, which is that I think it's crucial to demystify what they're actually doing, because misleading discourses and messaging is part of how they have impact. That is their approach, right? In regards to what I'd call like the discursive approach, they focus on constructing others and outsiders, right? Feminists, migrants. Their kind of ideologies are based on premises of exclusion. They frequently use appropriating and co-opting human rights and even feminist language at times. They focus in terms of myth building, emotion, and kind of narratives grounded in fear and repression. And they see ideological transformation a lot of times consciously as metapolitics, as like a precondition to political change. So they're trying to win a battle of ideas, right? So there's different fronts on which they're working in terms of their approach. And then key discourses include, like discussed in the report, include around abortion, the ideas of conscientious objection and prenatal genocide, conscientious objection, which is aiming and arguing there's a human right for healthcare professionals to conscientiously object to participation in abortion and forms of contraception, which is framed in a misleading way, right? In terms of the actual human rights that are at play there. And it's also framed in a way to try to make it seem innocuous, while it's actually, they don't have the right to prevent the fulfillment of other people's right to health, right? Prenatal genocide is another one. What we see a lot of is sort of bad faith approaches that instrumentalize the work of progressive movements in service of an anti-abortion agenda. And rather than seeking to sort of address structural and systemic issues that prop up these forms of oppression, right? Anti-rights actors are seeking to limit everyone's access to reproductive health and rights. And cultural imperialism and ideological colonization is another one that appears in the report, which is crops up again and again and again, often in concert with sort of arguments about asserting national sovereignty in very selective ways. And these ones kind of assert that human rights frameworks and advancements on gender and sexuality are Western or secular. And this does a lot of what you were mentioning earlier, actually, Isabel, in terms of the work of trying to present culture as static and as them having the authoritative notion of what that is. So there's a lot of different discourses that they employ that were mentioned, but I think there's a lot of these common threads, right? So gender ideology is huge, especially in some regions, and national sovereignty, protection of the family, the fake concept of parental rights. Again, we see how they try to co-opt the human rights concepts in service of retrogressive agendas. And then sort of misleading discourses around religious freedom and rights to culture. Also, in terms of approach, I'll just mention that, so sort of, those are the discourses. How do the tactics work? How do they enter into these spaces and why, right? So I'd say that it's often like a Trojan horse strategy. And I think there's a great graphic of that in the report. So like the idea is to enter into the global spaces and regional spaces from the inside out to change them to reflect their regressive agendas. But it's also a double strategy, right? So not all anti-rights actors are approaching in the same way. Some are doing the infiltration approach to shape the system to their own objectives. And then other people are seeking to simply sort of undermine the system and stop it from being able to operate by delegitimizing and defunding it. Some specific tactics they use are institutionalization of anti-rights actors and UN mechanisms, opting out, delegitimization, lowering human rights standards, like I said, co-optation with the overall aim of sort of building a human rights framework. And they also, which was mentioned in the previous hour's work, focus a lot in terms of mobilization, especially youth mobilization to build their base, online organizing like Citizen Go, and a lot of training in international connections. And so the last thing I'd say is sort of you were asking about what's new, where are we now? There's both been amazing amounts of feminist organizing and impacts, you know, at the national, regional, and international level at the UN in terms of rights to gender and sexuality. And it's been, the report talks a lot about that, and it's really key. And at the same time, I think the current context we need to keep in mind that, as you were saying at the beginning, we're seeing the rise of the far right. Now more than half the world's populations are governed by far right leaders. We're seeing wider and growing trends of, I'd say specifically, mainstreaming the extreme, right? And so there's an increase in power and influence and wider pervasiveness. And lastly, I'd say that we've all seen a lot of how anti-rights actors have attempted to use the pandemic, to use the COVID crisis to further entrench fundamentalisms and fascisms.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we've collectively we have tried to get across in this report, like you said, is to kind of help people see beyond the rhetoric, because the like you said, the cross-cutting themes are that we do still have fascists and fundamentalists that make themselves very known for what they are. They do still exist, but most of these actors that we're looking at are using much more convincing language, language that could convince me if I wasn't in the thick of this every day, you know, using the language of racial justice, things like Black unborn lives matter, things like that, using these, you know, playing on ideas around disability and actually taking things that are, you know, real issues. These are very valid concerns, but they're just taken in a totally different direction to then prop up whatever power it is that they're protecting. So I think that's something we have to kind of keep emphasizing, especially when it comes to the human rights system, where that is the entry point to make yourself look like a human rights organization, then to have power within the committees, by having ECOSOC status, to have a voice in the debate, and that's what we're trying to get across, that they are not what they seem most of the time. Mirta, maybe you want to tell us a bit more, if you want to elaborate from the perspective of Latin America, or tell us more about where you think we are today. Maybe do you have are there any rays of hope you see, even though there are these bad trends rising? Maybe you can also share that if you feel it's appropriate.
Thank you. I would say that anti-rights groups are organized groups with the ultimately goal to undermine the universality of rights. And I say this because in the beginning we thought that it was about gender. But now we know that they want to get back basic human rights standards on equality and non-discrimination. And I would say that even to undermine democracy. And this is important to take in account, so we can have like an intersectional analysis about this. In the LAC region, and this is a call to please go to chapter 6 of the report if you want to know more about the LAC region. They adopted and that what we called, and this is actually a term put together by Juan Marco Bajone, it's the strategic secularism, which is the ways in which diverse groups tamp down their religious dogma and usurp the secular language to confront feminist, women's rights, and LGBT agendas. And this is, I think it's really important for us to take in account, because we actually need to revisit our own perspective about secularism because of all these entry points of the anti-right groups. So this strategy of strategic secularism allows them to also be able to work first with different churches, hiding their internal disagreement with there are internal disagreements, but this strategy allows them to hide all these disagreements that they have. Also, they legitimize their presence on the democratic spaces and the discussion on public policies without being kind of quote unquote accused for deploying religious arguments. So that's a new complexity in the discussion of the public spaces, because this is not anymore about religious. It's about democracy, it's about values and all this secular discourse, which is complex, as you both say. Something that I was thinking about where I heard Naureen is that there's something that, in a way, first being at the UN, and there's a trend when we see something in the UN, after that we can see that same strategy at the OAS, at the Organization of American States, and then the same at the domestic level. So we can see like a different levels of coordination among these groups. So I would say that something that is new is how they expanded their organization and coordination at the regional and also at the domestic level. So it's possible to see coordinated way to work at the OAS on the one hand, and on the other hand, also coordinated ways to work from country to country. And I would say, for example, that in the last year, several countries in LAC underwent the same processes regarding the position to comprehensive sexuality education, for example, or the gender's perspective on education. So you can see the same campaign in different countries with the same discourse and the same aesthetic even, because we have these all these the same like blue and pink like flyers everywhere in LAC, in the LAC region. So there is a coordination among these actors regarding the strategies, the aesthetic, the discourses, even the actors, how they present themselves. Because we have, and there's for me a concerning emergence of women as women with the discourse that feminist women do not represent me, and on the other hand, young people. And it's like a renewed path of younger people going into the anti-rights movement. But I don't know if I can call this hope, but something that for me it's clear is that they learn from us. Mm-hmm. So they learn about coordination, organization, strategies, how to be together from the feminist and LGBTQ movement. And for example, and they try to for example, we have at the OAS, we have the LGBT core group of countries that are friendly to LGBT issues. And now they are trying to organize the family, life and family core group, for example. So they learn from us. And I think that's something that we should take in account when we think our strategies and how we can respond to them, because they didn't know how to do this if it weren't for their intents of blocking us. So they are all around us. So I think we should take this as an opportunity to think about our strategies and to respond to them. And also I would say it's good that we have all this information now, because it's a very, very important tool to think about strategies on how to respond.
Absolutely. I think it's good to remember that a lot of these things are happening in reaction to things that we have won, or, in a kind of copycat of some of our tactics. And sometimes, it is them that's on the back foot. So that's good to hear. And what you said about kind of the country to country transmission of these different tactics, we know that that's something they're consciously doing. When you see the kind of international meetups, the kind of extravaganzas of different right-wing groups in the World Congress of Families or in the Political Network for Values, they are, it's a proactive thing that they're doing to have these spaces to share their strategies. I also wanted to just say I was glad that you kind of drew on the point of universality of rights, because I think some people, when they hear us talk about anti-rights actors, they're kind of like, oh, it's so many different things in one basket. But I think that's kind of the point, that we're trying to emphasize that while, yes, there's an anti-abortion agenda, an anti-LGBT agenda, but these things don't exist in silos. And there's a kind of more overarching worldview of these agendas. Yes, sometimes it differs between different groups, but there's something a lot more overarching that ultimately threatens the basis of everybody's rights. And that kind of helps us see that we have to have a cross-movement response and not kind of respond in silos as well. So that was great to hear. So I think, we could talk about this for quite some time, but let's take a little break and hear from Dr. Tlaling Mofokeng, who's the Special Rapporteur in the field of health. She's going to share some reflections from the same event, where she was talking about her experience of anti-rights attacks and maybe what we should do about them. So let's hear from Dr. T.
Even when the announcement was made of my appointment as SR, I had sustained attacks for weeks on end, right? And some from the very familiar anti-choice and anti-gender groups. And it was through social mobilization that colleagues, pushed back on that, because what happens is that they try to isolate you, right? And present you as if you are an outlier with these ridiculous ideas about gender equality. Well, in fact, the United Nations has done incredible work in affirming human rights, but also sexual and reproductive rights particularly. And I think we are entering in a phase now where all of us have spoken theoretically about breaking down the silos, but we actually have no choice but to work collaboratively and strategically across the different thematic areas, because the systems that reinforce oppression are the same, whether you are talking about patriarchy, whether you are talking about misogyny, whether you are talking about capitalism, right? They all reinforce each other to lead to vulnerability and marginalization.
Welcome back to everybody watching. And just as a quick reminder to anybody tuning in, please do leave us questions, leave us comments so that our wonderful guests can answer them. And feel free to also share this broadcast to your feed on whichever platform you're watching on. So we heard from Dr. T there. I found her comments really inspiring, especially this message that, we've talked about coming together, breaking down the silos and working across movements and sectors for a while, but now's really the time to do it. I thought that was great. And that's actually, part of the title of the report is Time for Action. And it feels like we've built up this amazing collective knowledge of anti-rights trends, and we have this amazing foundation to go off, and I think it's now the time to push for concrete change. So what do you think are the main things? What are the main changes you'd like to see in this area? And Mirta, do you want to share with us first?
Yeah, sure. I would say we need to work especially in three issues. The first, I would say, is intersectionality. I think intersectionality is key to think about our strategies, to build solidarity among movements, to see that this is not only about feminist movement or LGBT movement, this is about human rights and even democracy, as I said before. So we need to work in an intersectional perspective to put all this together and work closely with other movements. Secondly, I would say that maybe we need to kind of reassess our own power in a way, because there's something that we feel when we see all these attacks coming. And I think it's important for us to feel that we are not alone, that we have built so many in our countries and in the international sphere. So in a way, try to be mindful of our gains, our own strength, about what we can build together, and to, in a way, try to fit in our own hope. I know it's not that easy. It's especially in the last year or so, in the context of the pandemic, I think a lot of people kind of lost a lot of hope. But I think we need to do this in a all together. And the third, but last but not least, I would say that we should strengthen our alliances, like inter-movement alliances, and I would say especially with the children's rights movement, because it's important that we realize that they are trying to go back to the standard that was out in the 90s. They try to take us to the 80s, actually, in the children's rights standard, human rights standard. So it's important that we build solidarity with them, and that they know that we actually are allies to their cause, because it's also our own cause. And on the other hand, with the movement of people with disability. Because there are, I think we have much more in common than we thought. And I think there's a manipulation of the rights of people with disability that actually is undermined. It's also undermined their rights. So it's important that we strengthen alliances with, for me, these two movements, and to see how we can collaborate each other, and to see that we have much more in common than we thought.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that. And it's one of the case studies that we look at in the report around the Nairobi principles around SRHR and disability, which was this effort to kind of have some grounding principles that show that this is a collective struggle and not a point, doesn't have to be a point of division. And I think also, maybe just to jump off what you're saying, the alliances that we already have, but to make stronger between feminists and trans-led movements, because that's something as well that, we haven't mentioned it yet, but it's also something we talk about in the report, is the ways in which anti-trans feminists are at the forefront of the most vitriolic attacks on the rights of trans people, and in some instances kind of collaborating with the Christian right or far-right groups, in other cases not. But that's a point which is obviously been seen as a point that they think they can divide us on, and we need to be in solidarity with trans movements as well. I think there's other things, like in the context of the war on drugs, looking at how these far-right regimes, like in the Philippines or in Brazil, but also in other places, that's a big part of the agenda and the rhetoric, and being used to marginalized communities. So I think that's another place we can think about strengthening ties. But yeah, lots to think about there. Naureen, do you want to share some thoughts with us as well?
Sure. I mean, I completely agree with Mirta. First of all, yeah, no, I think, I mean, just to echo a bit of it, I mean, I think the needs for, I mean, as you put it, the central crux of the matter is, you know, one way of looking at it is the universality of rights, right? So like there's a collective fixation in terms of basically changing or trying to cut people out from who is considered human for the purposes of human rights, right? It's about trying to denude that concept. And I'd say a similar kind of move by anti-rights actors that shows how they're thinking holistically and acting holistically to attack a wide range of interconnected rights, right? And indeed democracy is also gender ideology, right? Because it in and of itself is framed to try to make itself elastic, all-encompassing, you know, attacking all forms of different sort of like social justice, you know, elements, progressions, so I think that they're actually, if you look at it, it's very clear how it's a very deep-rooted attempt to remake society and make reality their virtual reality. So I think starting from that position and realizing that then points to that piece of us working holistically, us working in solidarity and across movements, because indeed they are attacking, I mean, it is connecting to the rights and the work of multiple movements. And we often are, for understandable reasons, quite siloed, right? So certainly children's rights, certainly persons with disabilities. Also, I would say in terms of folks working on racial justice, migrant rights, when we have our conversations together, we notice how it impinges on each of these different issue areas and the ways in which coming together can sort of strengthen us. A big feature in terms of anti-rights movements is how we've, I think, mentioned the word coordinated a bunch of times in this conversation today, right? And again, it's about being strategic. It's about being coordinated in the same way, which is not to say that we are not already doing significant work of that kind, but just continuing to sharpen and build that. And the second thing I'd mention in terms of is also, I think Mirta, you or Isabel, you alluded to this earlier, which is kind of Mirta, you alluded to the cracks between. It's that it might be between anti-rights actors. What are their fault lines, right? How can we use our analysis to identify their fault lines and then to sort of pressure that? I think that is really important to think about concrete pieces. And also, I think it might be interesting to look at funding flows, for instance. What are the resources that are going into anti-rights movements? What is the fuel? Shining a spotlight on that, and then seeing what we can try to do to address that kind of material aspect that allows them to do their work. And I'd say, aside from that, I mean, you know, as you mentioned, I mean, the Ours and other feminist and progressive allies have built up this significant knowledge base on anti-rights trends, like to demystify how anti-rights actors are seeking to expand their power and create impunity, undermine accountability. And so I unsurprisingly really like the call to action because, and I'll speak a little bit to that, because like, I think what it's about is we have now these tools that let us see that virtual reality, right? We can see the doublespeak and disinformation. And the idea is to kind of unveil that. That the anti-rights movements are using to cloak their discourses so that they look like common sense instead of what they really are, which is excuses for discrimination and violence and dehumanization. And so I would just say, adding on to everything we've said, we can see the tactics, we can do the discourses, we can kind of demystify it. And now let's take it seriously. We are, but then also others. And I know the call to action kind of calls on different UN mechanisms and mandate holders and other policy actors to take sort of that kind of urgent action, strong coordinated action to sort of block the entry of anti-rights actors from global spaces, from regional spaces, and at the national level. And to work really, I think there's what we do together as movements, and then also in terms of engagement with other stakeholders in these global and regional spaces. Are they engaging, are they collaborating with feminist and social justice movements, right? To really address this, because that's where the knowledge is. And that's the way that we're actually going to be able to stop them from denuding these areas and reshaping them in service of their agendas. So.
Yeah, I think the thing to say maybe is also that feminists have been talking about this for a long time. We've been raising the alarm about fascisms and fundamentalisms when people were maybe, it wasn't so much in the mainstream media, it wasn't so much a talking point in the general discourse. So I think maybe the one positive that so much has come to the fore in recent years is that it is more part of the conversation, and I hope now that folks will kind of sit up and pay attention to our calls for action, including this one. I think we're going to come to the end of our conversation, but is there anything that either of you want to say as a closing point, or any, if you want people to take away one thing, or please share, either of you, before we wrap up?
I would say, I would suggest people to go to the report, and there's a lot of information that you can find there. I think we will have the translation to Spanish coming soon, I guess. So the LAC people, don't be afraid, you will have like a Spanish version of the report also available. And for me, it's important that we use this report, actually, as you say, a call to action. I think it's time that we actually, because I don't know, I feel that we have like a moment of when we paralyzed ourselves because of the attacks, but I think now we can overcome that and go to the action and to continue achieve gains that we actually achieved in multilateral places and in our countries. So for me, it's a call of hope also. I think we need to have more hope in what could be the future for us, and I would say for the democracy actually in our countries. So I want to end with a positive note. So go to the report, share in social media. We are there if you want to continue this conversation. And thank you, Awid and the Hours for the report, for all your amazing work, and also Naureen, because you put this together and it was an amazing and hard work also.
Absolutely, such a huge body of work there. Is there something else you want to let us close with, Naureen? Or?
Sure. I mean, I love the note that Mirta had, and thank you so much to you as well, to Mirta, and to everyone for putting this together. I totally echo the calls to read the report, to look into it, and to continue to share our knowledge across. I'm also a big hope person, and I think that's both a stance and it's also the truth, right? I mean, especially in these moments of sort of multiple and intersecting crises, I know, especially the past year, it's tough, and I know that sometimes when we look at a deep dive in terms of anti-rights actors like this, you can kind of feel like it's murking up there, and all you're seeing is sort of like the trees, right? But I do think that, I mean, the collective power of feminist and progressive movements is huge, right? The knowledge that we have together, that we have pieced this together of what is actually happening, is huge. The advances that we have made, the progressions we've made, are legitimately really amazing, I mean, I think movement power has been something which is actually very much, if we're going to talk about trends, really sparked even more so in the past several years, right? So it's both of these things. And I'd say, so building, I think, if we're going to take something away, is what we can do is continue to, coordinate together, push for coordinated action against this, and then to connect at local, national, regional, and global levels, right? In terms of sharing our effective, because there are lots of effective resistance and disruption strategies, and building on that. And so I'd like to also end with that sort of message of hope and to read the report. So. Yes.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I'd really like to thank you both, because, like you said, it can be heavy stuff, and talking to fierce feminists like you two really brings back my inspiration and gives me a lot of fuel to carry on doing this kind of work and believe that we're on the winning side. So thank you both. And for those who are watching, yes, please do access the report, download it, take it into your communities, share it with your colleagues, your networks. There's a whole bunch of knowledge building exercises, games, and prompt questions as well within there. So we hope that it'll be like a kicking off point for conversation, and that you'll also share, your findings with us, so that it's an ongoing discussion. If you're an academic or an educator, do take it into your classrooms. If there's any journalists watching today, dig into the things that we didn't have the capacity or the time to dig into, add to the toolbox of information that we've already created, so that so that we have even more information at our fingertips to counter these trends. And for everybody watching, if you also feel that it's time for action, please do access the call to action, add your name. We want to have as many voices from around the world echoing the call to action to stop the infiltration of UN spaces by anti-rights actors. So all that's left to say is thank you for watching, and thank you to both of you for participating. It's been an excellent conversation. Thank you.